I deem this reply a full acceptance of the Potsdam Declaration, which specifies the unconditional surrender of Japan.
In August 1945, Japan was almost defeated. Germany, its main ally in World War II, was already gone. Many cities in Japan were also destroyed due to continuous bombings. Many supplies of food, oil, weapons, and other military necessities were also cut off. But the main leaders of the Japanese military still refused to surrender. They were ready to defend the very islands of Japan, even if it meant that many soldiers and civilians might die. This is where one of the biggest questions in history began. What really pushed Japan to surrender? Was it the 2 atomic bombs dropped by the United States or the sudden entry of the Soviet Union into the war? Historians still debate this to this day. Some say that the atomic bombs were the main reason. They claimed that these bombs showed that the United States could wipe out a Japanese city with just one bomb. Others, however, believed that the Soviet Union's attack was also a major reason. This happened while Japan was still hoping that Moscow might help them negotiate peace with the United States and its allies. To understand the debate, we first need to look at Japan's situation before the first atomic bomb was dropped. On May 8, 1945, Nazi Germany surrendered, and the major war in Europe ended. But in Asia and the Pacific, the fighting against Japan continued. Japan still controlled some areas in China, Korea, Southeast Asia, and islands in the Pacific. However, its territory was quickly shrinking. The United States and its allies soon recaptured important islands and military bases. American forces also took Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Okinawa was important because it was close to Japan's main islands. It could be used as a base for a larger invasion. Because of this, the leaders of Japan knew that their country could now be invaded directly, but they were preparing for a strong defense. They gathered soldiers, planes, weapons, and even civilians who could help in the fight. Their plan was to make the invasion of Japan extremely costly in terms of enemy lives. They hoped that if enough American soldiers died, the United States might agree to a more lenient settlement. There were some leaders in Japan who wanted to end the war, but they didn't want to surrender unconditionally. Some in the government already knew winning was nearly impossible. This included Prime Minister Kentaro Suzuki, the head of the Japanese government during the last months of the war. But even though he wanted to find a way to end the fighting, he wasn't ready to immediately accept all the demands of the enemy. The leaders of Japan wanted to make sure that Emperor Hirohito would remain. Hirohito was the emperor and the symbolic leader of the country. For many Japanese at that time, he was not just an ordinary king or political leader. The people's respect and loyalty to him ran very deep. That's why the term unconditional surrender was a big problem for Japan. This meant they would surrender without any guarantee of what would happen to the emperor, the government, and their military leaders. There was another problem that slowed down the decision. In Japan, it wasn't just one person making the decisions. There was a group of 6 of the most powerful leaders called the Big Six. This included the Prime Minister, Foreign Minister, War Minister, Navy Minister, and the highest leaders of the Army and Navy. The group was divided. Some wanted to find a way to achieve peace. The military leaders, on the other hand, wanted to continue fighting until the enemies offered better terms. Because they were divided, it was difficult to make clear and quick decisions. Meanwhile, Japan was trying to ask the Soviet Union for help. At that time, the Soviet Union was not yet directly at war with Japan. Tokyo was hoping that Moscow could act as a mediator in talks with the United States and Britain. But the leaders of Japan did not know that the Soviet Union had already made an agreement with its allies. At the Yalta Conference in February 1945, Soviet leader Joseph Stalin promised that he would join the war against Japan. A few months after Germany was defeated, in exchange, the Soviet Union expected to have greater influence in Manchuria and to acquire South Sakhalin and the Kuril Islands. This means that while Japan was hoping that Stalin would help them in peace talks, the Soviet military was secretly preparing to attack their forces in Asia. In July 1945, the main Allied leaders gathered in Potsdam, near Berlin. American President Harry Truman was there. Soviet leader Joseph Stalin and the leaders of Britain were also there. One of the most important things they discussed was how to end the war against Japan. While Truman was at the conference, a very important message arrived from the United States. The first test of the atomic bomb was successful. It was called the Trinity Test. It was conducted on July 16, 1945 in New Mexico. This bomb was made under the Manhattan Project, a secret and massive program of the United States to develop a new type of weapon. This was not an ordinary bomb. It uses a nuclear reaction to release an enormous amount of energy in just a few seconds. After the successful test, the American government knew that it had a weapon far more powerful than any bomb used before. On July 24, Truman told Stalin that the United States had a new weapon with extraordinary power. He did not explain the full details, but Stalin already knew about the atomic project because Soviet intelligence was getting secret information from inside the program. 2 days later, the United States, Britain, and China issued the Potsdam Declaration. It ordered Japan to surrender all its armed forces. If Japan refused, the declaration warned that the country would face swift and complete destruction. The Soviet Union didn't sign because it remained neutral in the war against Japan. On the day the document was released, the Japanese leadership was once again divided. Some wanted to ask for a clear explanation, especially about the fate of the emperor. Others wanted to reject the declaration. In the end, Japan did not immediately accept the demand for surrender. Prime Minister Suzuki used a Japanese word that could mean they would ignore it for now or give no comment. But the United States interpreted this as a rejection. Meanwhile, the atomic bomb was already prepared. On the morning of August 6, 1945, an American B-29 bomber called Enola Gay took off. Its target was Hiroshima. Hiroshima was not a random city. It was an important military and communication center. There were military headquarters, supply facilities, and soldiers stationed there. But it was also a large city inhabited by many civilians. At around 8:15 in the morning, the Enola Gay dropped the atomic bomb called Little Boy. It exploded in the air, hundreds of meters above the city. In just a few seconds, an extremely intense light and heat appeared. The shockwave followed, destroying houses, buildings, schools, shops, and roads. Many people who were close to the center of the explosion died instantly. Others suffered severe burns, injuries, and radiation exposure. It is estimated that tens of thousands of people died on the very day of the attack. Even more people died in the following weeks, months, and years because of their injuries and the effects of radiation. According to the United States National Archives, nearly 70,000 people may have died immediately, while almost all buildings within about a mile from the center were destroyed or severely damaged. The Japanese government did not immediately understand what had happened. Communication with Hiroshima was lost. At first, only a little clear information reached Tokyo. The military even sent people to find out why the entire city suddenly went silent. When they arrived, they saw the extent of the destruction. It turned out that only one bomb had been used, but the damage it caused was equivalent to a massive air raid. After the explosion, President Truman announced that an atomic bomb had been used in Hiroshima. He said that Japan had already been given a chance to surrender through the Potsdam Declaration. He also warned that more attacks could follow if the Japanese government continued to refuse. But even after Hiroshima was destroyed, Japan still did not surrender immediately. Its main leaders still could not agree. Some still believed that the war should continue. And while they were discussing how to respond to a weapon they still did not fully understand, another great danger was approaching. The country they expected to help with the peace talks was preparing to join the war against them. 3 days after Hiroshima was destroyed, 2 new blows struck Japan at the same time. One was another atomic bomb. The other was the entry of the Soviet Union into the war. On August 8, 1945, Naoki Sato, Japan's ambassador to Moscow, went to ask for help in peace talks. But Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov did not give him any help. Instead, Molotov informed him that the Soviet Union was about to declare war against Japan. This was a huge blow to the Japanese government. The Soviet Union was the last country they hoped could mediate talks with the United States. Now, not only did that plan fail, the mediator they were hoping for even became their enemy. By August 9, more than 1 million Soviet soldiers attacked Manchuria, a large part of China that was then controlled by Japan. That was where the Kwantung Army, Japan's large force stationed in Manchuria, was positioned. The Soviet forces attacked simultaneously from different directions, using tanks, artillery, airplanes, and fast infantry units. The Kwantung Army could not stop their advance. Many of its best soldiers and equipment had already been transferred elsewhere before the attack began. Because of this, the Soviet forces quickly broke through their defenses. Manchuria was important to Japan because it had many soldiers, military bases, factories, railways, and supplies. If they lost this, Japan would lose a large territory and forces that they could have still used. There was another thing that the Japanese leaders feared. If the Soviet advance continued, their army could also reach Korea and the northern part of Japan. This means that Japan could possibly be divided and occupied by different countries, just like what happened to Germany. On that same day, Japan's top leaders held a meeting. They were still divided over the decision. The civilian leaders, including Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo, were willing to accept the Potsdam Declaration as long as Emperor Hirohito would remain. But most of the military leaders had heavier demands. They did not want foreign troops to occupy Japan. They wanted Japan itself to disarm its own military. They also wanted Japanese authorities to handle the trials of suspected war criminals. In other words, they wanted the war to end, but they did not want to give the enemy full control over Japan. While they couldn't reach an agreement, another piece of news arrived. On August 9, the American B-29 bomber called Boxcar dropped the atomic bomb known as Fat Man on Nagasaki. The original target was supposed to be Kokura, but it was covered by clouds and smoke. So the bomber moved to Nagasaki. The bomb exploded over the city. It is estimated that about 35,000 to 40,000 people died immediately, or within a short time after the explosion, thousands more died later due to wounds, burns, and radiation. In just a few days, the two cities were destroyed. At the same time, the Soviet Union was rapidly attacking the Japanese forces in Manchuria. But even with a situation this dire, the votes of the main leaders were still tied. Because they couldn't make a decision, they asked Emperor Hirohito to decide. This was a very rare occurrence. Usually, the emperor does not directly intervene in this kind of debate. But now, he said that the war should be ended. He believed that if this continued, the whole country would be destroyed, and even more people would die. He agreed to accept the Potsdam Declaration on one condition: his position as emperor should not be taken away. On August 10, Japan sent this offer to the United States and its allies. They did not give a direct guarantee that the emperor's full authority would remain. They said that from the time of surrender, he and the Japanese government would be under the authority of the Allied commander. They also said that the future government of Japan would depend on the will of the Japanese people. In practice, after the war, Hirohito remained as emperor, but he no longer had control over the military and the government. He became the symbolic leader under Japan's new system. Some military officers still could not accept the surrender. On the night before the announcement, some young officers tried to stop the emperor's message. They entered the imperial palace and searched for the recording of his surrender speech. They hoped to destroy it so the war could continue, but their coup failed. On August 15, for the first time, many Japanese people heard Emperor Hirohito's voice on the radio.
Hoping.
He did not directly use the simple word surrender, but the message was clear. Japan will accept its enemy's demands and will end the war. On September 2, 1945, representatives of Japan signed the official instrument of surrender on the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. That was where World War II formally ended. But the big question remains, why did the United States choose to use the atomic bomb. The main explanation of the American government is simple. They wanted to end the war quickly and avoid a massive invasion of Japan. Even before the atomic bomb was ready, the American military was already making plans to invade the main islands of Japan. The entire plan was called Operation Downfall. It had two major parts. The first was Operation Olympic. Its plan was to land Allied troops on the southern island of Kyushu in November 1945. Once they secured bases there, Operation Coronet would follow. This was the major assault near Tokyo planned for 1946. But Japan knew that the invasion was coming, so they created their own defense plan called Ketsugo. Japanese commanders knew defeating the United States completely would be difficult, so they aimed to make the invasion as hard and bloody as possible. They would deploy a huge number of soldiers, airplanes, suicide aircraft, and civilian lookouts. This was to defend the areas where Allied troops might land. They hoped that if American casualties were very high, the United States would be forced to negotiate for better terms for Japan. The United States had reason to be afraid of this plan. In Iwo Jima and Okinawa, American forces saw how fiercely the Japanese military fought even when it was clear they were going to lose. In Okinawa alone, more than 10,000 American servicemen were killed or went missing, and tens of thousands were wounded. A very large number were also killed on the Japanese side, including many civilians. There was no definite number for how many would die in an invasion of Japan. The estimates varied because the planners did not yet know how long the battle would last, how strong the actual defenses were, or how many civilians would join. Some estimates were lower. There were also estimates that reached up to hundreds of thousands of American dead and wounded if the entire operation dragged on. That's why the important thing in the decision was not just the exact number. What mattered was that the American leaders believed the invasion would be extremely bloody. For President Harry Truman, the atomic bomb was a way to end the war before the invasion had to be launched. There was also pressure from the public. America was already exhausted after many years of war. Families wanted their soldiers to come home, but they also didn't want to give Japan an easy deal. Not after Pearl Harbor and the long battles in the Pacific. So for historians who support the main explanation, the bombs were used to force Japan to surrender quickly and to avoid more casualties on both sides. But there are other historians who aren't convinced that this is the only reason. For them, the United States was already thinking about the next problem after World War II, the Soviet Union. Before the successful atomic test, America still wanted the help of Soviet forces against Japan. But when Truman learned that the new weapon worked, his need for Stalin's help decreased. If Japan surrendered before the Soviet Union could take a large part of Asia, Moscow's influence after the war would be smaller. Because of this, some historians say that the atomic bomb was not just a weapon against Japan. It was also a way to show the Soviet Union the new power of the United States. But it's also not enough to say that the bomb was used just to scare Moscow. The war was still ongoing at that time. Japan had not yet surrendered. The American military was still planning the invasion, and the United States was also not sure if a single atomic bomb would be enough to force the Japanese leadership. So the real reason is more complicated. America wanted to end the war quickly. It wanted to avoid the invasion. And at the same time, it was also thinking about who would have power in Asia once Japan was finally defeated. But to know which was the biggest reason for the surrender, we need to look not only at what the United States was thinking, we need to look at what the Japanese leaders themselves feared the most. The atomic bombs, the Soviet invasion, or the two threats arriving at the same time that they could no longer stop. This is where the debate heats up even more. Why did the United States rush to use the atomic bomb if the Soviet Union was also going to enter the war? According to some historians, President Harry Truman wanted to end the war before the Soviet Union could gain greater control in Asia. At first, Soviet military assistance was important for America, but after the first atomic bomb test was successful, Truman had another way to force Japan to surrender. The American government was also afraid of the growing power of Soviet leader Joseph Stalin. After Germany was defeated, the Soviet Union controlled a large part of Eastern Europe. The United States was worried that the same thing might happen in Asia. If the Soviet army penetrated deep into Manchuria, Korea, and the islands of Japan, it could demand its own share in the occupation and administration of the region. So for some historians, the atomic bomb was not meant to send a message only to Japan. It also showed the Soviet Union that America had a new weapon that could not be matched at that time. But not all historians accept this. There is no solid evidence that the main purpose of the atomic bomb was simply to intimidate the Soviet Union. The war was still ongoing, Japan had not yet surrendered, and both sides were still preparing for a possible invasion. There is also debate about the Potsdam Declaration. Before the atomic bomb was dropped, there were some American officials who wanted to make it clear to Japan that the emperor could still remain after surrendering. They knew that Emperor Hirohito was very important to the Japanese people and government, but this was not clearly included in the declaration. For some historians, if America had immediately assured that the emperor would remain, Japan might have surrendered earlier. But for other historians, there is still no certainty. Here, the Japanese military might think that America is weakening and that they could still ask for more conditions. The hardline military leaders of Japan also did not show any willingness to surrender before the events of August, even though many cities were destroyed and supplies were running low. And even with the naval blockade tightening, they still wanted to continue the fight. So we return to the most important question. What really changed Japan's mind? For one side of the debate, the atomic bombs were the biggest reason. Hiroshima and Nagasaki showed that America could destroy an entire city with just one bomb. Japanese leaders also didn't know how many more the United States had. They might have thought that Tokyo or other major cities would be next. They also knew they had no defense against such a weapon. Even if they continued with the Kitsugo defense plan, America could bomb their cities first, even before the invasion began. It was also clear from Emperor Hirohito's message that the new bomb with extraordinary power was a major reason for his decision. He wanted to prevent the destruction of another city and the total devastation of the entire country. But some historians say that the entry of the Soviet Union had a bigger impact. Before this, Japan was still hoping to use Moscow as a mediator. They planned to ask for a peace agreement that was more lenient than unconditional surrender. When the Soviet Union declared war, that hope was completely lost. Moscow could no longer be a mediator because it had become an enemy. The possibility of the Soviet army entering the Japanese islands themselves was even more frightening for the Japanese leaders. If that happened, the country could be divided like Germany. Communism could also spread, and the emperor and his family could be completely removed. For these historians, the Japanese military could endure it. The destruction of the cities was bearable because many cities had already been destroyed by conventional bombing. In March 1945, American bombers burned a large part of Tokyo. Tens of thousands of people died in just one night. So even though the atomic bomb was different and more powerful, widespread destruction and civilian deaths were nothing new to the Japanese leaders. The Soviet invasion destroyed their remaining military and political plan. There was no mediator left. A new large army was advancing from the north, and there was a threat that their country would be occupied by two different superpowers. But it's also hard to say that the atomic bombs didn't have a significant impact. After Hiroshima, the leaders who wanted to surrender now had a reason to say that Japan was facing no ordinary defeat. They were defeated by a weapon that their country could neither make nor stop. This helped the military accept surrender without directly saying that they were only defeated in an ordinary battle. In other words, the effects of the two events may have been different. The Soviet invasion destroyed Japan's last strategy. Meanwhile, the atomic bombs provided a clear and terrifying reason to end the war immediately. There is also the question of whether the war could have ended in another way without using the atomic bombs. America could have continued the naval blockade and conventional bombing, but this was not a peaceful option. Many Japanese civilians could have died from hunger, fire, disease, and continued air raids. The killings in China, Korea, Southeast Asia, and other territories still held by Japan could have also continued. America could have also just waited for the full effect of the Soviet invasion. However, there was a risk that Soviet control in Asia could grow and Japan might be fully divided. And if none of those methods worked, the final plan was a full-scale Allied invasion, which would surely result in massive casualties on both sides. So there's no simple answer that says only one event ended the war. The documents and statements from leaders at that time also differ. There are statements saying they were more afraid of the atomic bomb. Others say the shock of the Soviet invasion was greater. There are also memoirs written after the war when some leaders were already trying to defend their actions or avoid responsibility. What's clear is that Japan did not surrender after Hiroshima alone. The situation changed when the Soviet declaration of war and the second atomic bomb came almost at the same time. After this, Emperor Hirohito intervened directly and chose to end the war. According to documents released by the National Security Archive, some Japanese leaders saw the atomic bomb and the Soviet declaration of war as joint reasons that hastened the surrender. So the question is not just whether it was the atomic bomb or the Soviet invasion. It's more accurate to ask how these two events together destroyed all of Japan's remaining hope. The atomic bomb showed that their cities could be wiped out. The Soviet invasion, on the other hand, showed that there was no country left to act as a mediator and no safe direction to escape. In August 1945, it wasn't just one door that closed for Japan. All doors closed at the same time and when the surrender was formally signed on September 2, 1945. World War II ended, but a debate began that remains alive to this day.